Happy Sabbath, everybody. Um, please join me for a opening word of prayer. Dear God, I'm grateful to be able to be with you and be with everyone this Sabbath to study together. I pray and ask that as we go through these studies, the Holy Spirit, may guide us so that it is you lifted up and not us. I pray and ask that we may understand what it is that we are learning, and if there is any truth in it, I ask that it may be comprehensible. I thank you, as always. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. Okay, so um, today's studies, this first one and the second one, are going to be on two different topics. Um, and so that's why I thought it beneficial to split them up into two different presentations instead of trying to combine everything together because they have different themes. Um, I had asked earlier in the week if um, my first two presentations that I did last week with the German group could be watched. However, I recognize that that was a lot of content in 1 week to go over. So if anyone didn't have the opportunity to watch those, then that's okay because I'll review most of it while tying in some of the themes that I wanted to build on top of that into today's presentation. So the the key point that I was looking at in those studies was how the image of the beast is created, how it goes about its development. And we find that story of the image of the beast in Revelation 13. We find a story of Beast 1 and Beast 2 in your Bibles. If you have a study Bible, they might be demarcated into two different sections, where the first beast is describing the papacy and the second beast is describing the lamb-like beast that turns into a dragon. And so if we go to Revelation 13, um, we can go through some of those steps together. And so if you open Revelation 13, I'll read them, but if you want to follow along, then that's okay. So, as I said, the first 10 verses are going to tell you about beast number 1. So, in Revelation 13, we have verse 1 to 10, which is about the first beast. And then you have verse 11, 11 to 18 about the second beast. There is overlap within them because there's a lot of references made in that second section to beast number 1. But if you just keep that as a framework to work with. So in this description of beast number 2, John says that he sees a beast coming up out of the earth. And this is in reference to 1798. Where America is rising up. It's a different nation. It has two horns, and we've done studies that point out that those two horns represent republicanism and Protestantism. Illinois tells us that. But it transitions. It transitions from being a lamb-like beast with these two horns to speaking like a dragon. And that emphasis is that it's the same beast that you have that is lamb-like that goes through a different phase to become the second beast, the dragon. It just says it speaks like a dragon, but as we know from the Bible, from Proverbs and Matthew, is that what you speak is an indication of who you are, essentially. So even though it says it speaks like a dragon, it is a dragon. And so there's two phases it goes through. Phase 1, or phase A, is lamb-like nature. and then phase B is this dragon phase. If we can call it USA 1, and then because it goes through a transition, it's the same entity. I want us to see that it's the same entity in phase 1 and phase 2. So USA 2 is this dragon. It's not a different entity that you can make application to this dragon. It's the same entity. Um, and then we get to verse 12 in Revelation 13, and that says that this dragon now is going to behave like the first beast before it, the one that we read in verses 1 through to 10. And it's
Hi,
going to,
sorry, Curtis.
yeah,
Sorry, I had my hand up. I noticed you're
okay,
not seeing it.
yeah.
Uh, I just wanted to ask something that when you're speaking about that the lamb-like beast,
Hmm.
I just wanted to ask if you're placing the dragon-like characteristics and the lamb-like characteristics on two different periods or they run concurrently.
I'm I'm trying to point out that there's a transition. Whether it goes through a transitionary phase, I think that that's something that we can explore. There's a bit of an overlap because we have that modeling with the seven churches where you have seven and one overlapping until one is fully established. So, and we have that modeling from Panium to the Sunday Law where there's an overlap. But in earnest, at the beginning, it's only phase one lamb-like. And then I think we can all recognize that it's at the Sunday Law where we have this dragon entity. So there's an overlap uh, between the two. It's not like a strict demarcation point.
No, no,
It,
no. Yeah, I just wanted to know if it's the characteristics are running concurrently, as in from the beginning, like 1798. You
so,
have the
mhm,
USA being a lamb-like beast, but you
yeah,
see also
yeah.
dragon tendencies, or you're saying no, the USA begins as a lamb and then it transitions to a dragon.
I'm saying the latter, that it begins in phase one as lamb-like at this point, and then it makes a transition to being a dragon later down the road. At least that's the way I see it. Um, that it becomes this dragon when it starts speaking like a dragon. But at the beginning, it's still this lamb-like beast, and that's not to say that it loses its horns, because as we recognize republicanism and Protestantism, they don't stop. It doesn't stop having these lamb-like horns, but it starts speaking
Profession
like a
and
dragon.
practice.
Yeah, exactly. Profession and practice.
So,
Uh,
so that's, I guess that's where I was just trying to understand as well,
okay.
that you have the USA having a profession and it runs from the beginning
Hmm.
with that profession, and then you have the practice, which pretty much contradicts the profession. So I just wanted to know if
Yeah.
it's something like the dragon tendencies can be marked from the beginning, or we can't see it from the beginning, but we have to mark it at a certain point where it transitions.
Hello,
Um,
If you
Charity.
understand what I'm
Can I
saying.
just interject there, Charity? I don't know if you came in the beginning, but Curtis did ask if there are going to be any questions, if we can relay them at the end. So if we can just let Curtis
Oh,
do his presentation, please.
oh, sorry.
That's
I
okay.
wasn't in. I was waiting to
No, that's all
be
right. Okay. All
to
right.
okay.
be
Go
let
on,
in.
Curtis, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah, so just for anyone who joined later, I had asked that um, I don't mind clarifying questions, like short clarifying questions about something I've specifically said, but more debate-worthy questions, I think we can leave till the end. I'm not trying to avoid the debate. It's just I want to try and get through as much as I can. Okay, so having said that, in verse 12, this dragon is going to behave like what came before it, what we saw in verses 1 to 10. Um, and it's going to cause the people to worship beast number one that's resurrected. That's the story of verse 12. And then verse 12 to 14 elaborates on how this dragon is going to behave. You can read that in your own time. But then when we get to verse 14, while this beast that came up in verse 11 is in its dragon phase, it's going to demand to the people that they make an image to the beast. So they make a copy of beast number 1. The dragon is telling the people to do this. And Ellen White gives a bit of commentary on these verses in chapter 25 of The Great Controversy. There's specific paragraphs that I think are relevant to what we're talking about, which is GC 442 paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. And in that, it points out that America is this representative government where legislative power rests with the people. And she points out that the USA fulfills these characteristics. And so the one thing that I want to mark here is that it's representative. So all the leaders and the politicians are in place due to representation. So they are proxies, if you want to call it, of the people. And it's embedded within America's fabric to function that way. That's the will of the people that's expressed by representatives. And then in the same paragraph, she says that it's going to get to this point where it creates a Sunday law, and this is going to be contrary to the principles of the government. And so when America was founded, there's various institutions that were created to protect this nation so it could function. And just reading that paragraph, that snippet, it says, such action would be directly contrary to the principles of this government, to the genius of its free institutions, to the direct and solemn avowals in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so there's 3 things that are mentioned there. There's principles that this government is based on, which is republicanism and Protestantism. And the second thing is Ellen White points out that there's institutions that keep us grounded. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are those institutions? Especially when we start talking about the USA and shipwreck at the Sunday law. And it's framed as a story about institutions that are shipwrecked. So when you start questioning what institutions are, I think you can go in a direction where you start grappling with what it is exactly that's shipwrecked at the Sunday law. And the third thing that she points out, Ellen White points out, is that there's specific vows that were made when America was founded. And we find those vows expressed in the Declaration of Independence, those vows to freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of property or happiness as it's framed. And then you get to verse 15. And in verse 15, we read about this dragon that is in its dragon phase is going to give power, or it's going to give life to the image that the people created. So this image is created, and then this dragon is going to be the one that gives life to, or power, however you want to phrase it, to this image that has been created. And then after verse 15, John is going to describe the behavior of the image of the beast and the dragon as they force people to worship that image of the beast and pay homage to the papacy. So we have this structure of an image created, or a nation that rises up, develops, and then goes through 2 different phases, phase A and phase B. And phase B is its dragon phase. And in that structure, that dragon is going to give life to an image that was created. So we have this framework that John sets up. And Ellen White tells us in GC, in that same chapter, GC 443, paragraph 1, that I won't read it, but I'll paraphrase. She says, what is this image to the beast and how is it formed? It's a question she's asking. And she points out that this image is made by the 2-horned beast and is an image to the first beast. So she's pointing out that this two-horned beast stays with its two horns, as we were discussing with Charity, but in its dragon phase, it creates this image to the first beast, also called the image of the beast. But it's the second part of that paragraph that I want to pick out, is that to learn what the image is like and what's to be formed, she points us back into history. So she's going to encourage us to do a compare and contrast, to study the characteristics of the beast that came before, the papacy essentially. And so I would suggest that it's not only the characteristics that we can learn when we compare and contrast the papacy and this second beast from verse 11 onwards. We can also understand how it's created. And so we know that history pretty well. Uriah Smith will comment on that history. The pioneers will, Ellen White will give commentary on this established history. So let's go back to the papacy, or those first 10 verses. Again, I'm just going over this because not everyone might have had the opportunity to watch those presentations from last week. But in verse 1, we read about the papacy essentially, standing up out of the sands, coming up out of the sands of the sea, and it's rising up, and it has 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns on those heads, and upon the name of the person riding this beast, if you want to call it that, is the name of blasphemy. So it's this church-state relationship. If you want to run that name of blasphemy through Revelation, it's the same imagery that you have in Revelation 17, I think, where on the forehead of the person riding that beast is the mother of harlots, etc. And then in verse 2, John is going to point out that this dragon that already exists, is going to give power, seat, and authority to this beast that is rising up. So it's the same dynamic that you have in what we discussed earlier, that this dragon, that a dragon, is going to give power, seat, and authority to the beast. We spoke about the image of the beast needing to get power and life from the dragon, and now looking back into history, we have the dragon giving the beast power. And if you run through those, you can do repeat and enlarge to identify those symbols, those heads, those horns, and those 10 crowns. And we're not going to do that. But again, in verse 4, John repeats the same thing, that the dragon gave power to this beast, and people in that time period worship the beast. So I want to go back and think about when the papacy started rising, when it finished its rise, when it started ruling supremely, but before that, at least, when it started this transitionary period to get to that point. So we're all familiar with the year 538, and we mark that as the start of the 1260. But for the papacy to get to that point where it could reign supremely, it had to go through a preparatory work. And in, again, that same chapter, Ellen White is going to talk about how there was a falling away that came from the churches, and it prepared the way for the development of the papacy. So the papacy needed a period of development before it could be the papacy, this combination of church and state at 538. So there's different ways in which you can look at this history, and as we do with any study with prophecy, it's the perspective that you're looking at that will determine how you use symbols or how you use waymarks in history. Because in one story, one waymark may represent something, and in another story, that waymark may represent something else. Elder Test demonstrates this with 1945 as lining up with Panium, but in a different story, 1989 lines up with Panium, and so on and so forth, where a waymark can represent different things. I mention that because if you look at this power, seat, and authority, looking at it from that perspective, in breaking up those three different steps, you could place those three different things in three different places in the 300s to the 500s history. But I'm going to look at it from a different perspective, which is the rise of the papacy in and of itself. So, and this story that I'm suggesting we explore starts in 313 AD, or the year before. But basically, in 313, what happened is that it was the beginning of the 4th century, and the Roman Empire had reached this ecclesiastical organization, and so they were anxious to assert the government as a kind of sovereignty for itself. And so later down the road, under the influence of Constantine, there was an edict that was passed, the Edict of Milan, that we may be familiar with if we've read Ellen White's writings, as well as any of the other pioneers who give commentary on this time period. That was in 313 AD. But what that edict pointed out was that there had been persecution of Christians that took place for years before by the Roman Empire, by pagan Rome. And it got to a point where persecution ceased. So there's persecution happening all in this history. And then it gets to the point where this edict is passed, and Constantine is going to say, you Christians need liberty and full freedom to observe your own modes of worship. It's interesting that this is how it started, and then you end up with the papacy. But essentially, there's persecution that takes place of Christians by pagan Rome, and then persecution ends when this edict is enforced by Constantine. But up to what led to this edict being passed, because Constantine was pretty much a pagan himself leading up to here. But a year earlier, Constantine, will say, discovered Christianity, or he had his new birth experience. And so historical accounts point out that Constantine's life changed at a battle that he was fighting. And in that battle, he saw a cross in the sky, and he saw that as a sign from the Christian God that he is being protected. Constantine is being protected. And so after that battle, he converts to Christianity. So this Edict of Milan wouldn't have been passed if in 312 Constantine didn't convert to Christianity. So I'm just going to put convert here. So there's this relationship where Constantine converts to Christianity, and then a year later he recognizes that, hold on, I'm a Christian, and these Christians have been persecuted, and so the Edict of Milan is passed. And so you have this cause and effect relationship between these two events. And the next step in the papacy's journey of rise is what was known as the Council of Milan. The Council of Nicaea, and that took place in 325. Now, why this was specifically significant is because for the first time, the Christian bishops convened in a place, and the place was called Nicaea. They met from about May till July, and it was a council to try and get consensus in the church as a whole that represented Christendom with regards to their doctrines. So they begin formalizing and laying the foundations for what we would now know today as the papacy for the Catholic Church. And so this was the first step in laying foundations for their beliefs. It was the first council called by Constantine himself. And the reason why he called this council is because in the years prior, there had been what was known as the Arian controversy. And in 321 AD, you could use other dates at this point, but I thought that this specific date, 321, was the most significant in this controversy, because in around 318 there was a priest whose name was Arius. That's why it's called the Arian controversy. Well, no, sorry. Yeah, his name was Arius, and he was from Alexandria in Egypt, I think. That was part of Christian Roman Empire, and he was teaching that Jesus Christ was created by what we would say is God the Father. He was a created being. I'm just using language that they used. And so this sparked debate and division within the church, because some people were saying, no, the Trinity is made up of three equal level beings, and others were under the leadership of this Arius guy, saying that no, Jesus, because he was made human, was a created being, so he's not on the same level or as God. And so in 321, there was a synod that was held in Alexandria, and he was officially condemned by the church under Constantine's guidance, as being a heretic. And it's from this point that this controversy really gained momentum. Before 321, it was just debate that was going on in Christendom. But from 321 onwards, it now comes to life, because followers of Arius were arguing that this is unfair, you're suppressing the truth, you're suppressing doctrine. And so if anything, it spurs them on to teach more. And then you get to the Council of Nicaea in 325 to resolve this specific crisis. But in resolving that crisis, they laid down other doctrinal truths in the Catholic Church. We're just going to call it the Catholic Church today. Prior to this, they hadn't done something similar. So again, you have this cause and effect relationship at this stage in the Catholic Church's rise, or the papacy's rise. The cause being this synod that was held, and the effect being Nicaea that takes place after, called by Constantine. And then the history that we're probably most familiar with is 533 and 538. In 533, as I'm sure we all should know at least, Justinian signs a decree. It's known as Justinian's decree, where he essentially says that the papacy is the head of the church, head of all churches, really. Or the Pope specifically is the head of all churches. And when the Millerites were studying the 1260 and the rise of the papacy, the two dates that they were toying with or debating between was 533 or 538. Just like what they and us were doing with regards to the three decrees to let the Israelites leave in 457 and etc. Is it when the decree is given or when it is put into effect? And eventually they, as in the Millerites, settled around 538 with regards to when it's put into effect. So the cause is when the decree was passed, and then in 538, when the Ostrogoths were defeated, it's put into effect. So again, you have this cause and effect relationship in this time period. And it's at this point where I would suggest the cause was where this concept is created by Justinian. The papacy was really given legs to stand on in 533, but it needs to go through a period of time before it can be put into effect, before the pagan Roman Empire can give their arms to the papacy, and that's what takes place in 538. So I'm suggesting that it's this created and this life dynamic that we were discussing earlier. So power or life is given to this beast that had been rising. So briefly, does anyone have any questions about these steps or these different waymarks and this relationship between two dates before I move on? No? Okay.
I
Sorry,
Curtis.
sorry.
Yeah,
Oh,
go Ignatius and then Charity.
All right. Oh, so basically explaining the rise of the papas, is it? That's
Mm-hmm.
Revelation chapter 13,
Mm-hmm.
verse 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we are moving together.
Mm-hmm. And
Okay.
as Manjit pointed out, the three horns had been fully plucked up by 538 once you get to that point. And just pointing out, because I've been asked this before, why I start this story in 313 or 312/312 is because if Christians had carried on being persecuted, and this persecution didn't stop, you wouldn't have everything else take place after the fact. So I see this as a significant point in time that really gives speed to the development of the papacy, much like how for us in the movement, we say that first the period of darkness has to come to a close before the truth can start coming out in 1798 or 1989. Yeah, Charity, you wanted to ask a question?
yes. When you spoke about the Council of Nicaea,
Hmm.
maybe I missed it. Is there a creed that was formulated at that point, like Nicene Creed or something?
I don't know if it was a creed specifically, but what the aim of that council was to lay the foundations for the church, to formalize their doctrine. So I think, like, if we would call it today, it was the church manual that was put together, because before that, it was just like scattered beliefs all around the church. But at this point, they start consolidating. They have arguments. It had ran for not just a day, for months, I think, where they argued and then came to a conclusion about these are our core beliefs.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem. Okay, so this is the story of the papacy's rise, and we see this same relationship. I'm highlighting this waymark here specifically, where there's a creation and then life being given to that creation. We see this same dynamic in the true, because this is the story of the counterfeit. But in the true, um, which is going back to Genesis and the creation of humanity in Genesis 2, verse 7, it talks about how God is going to form Adam out of the dust. So Adam is going to be created first. So it's just going to be this body that's created. And then after that body is created, there's going to be, I don't know how to even draw that, but there's going to be life, or the breath of life being given to Adam. And now Adam's going to be a living soul. And so this is a parable. It's the natural that is going to help us explain the spiritual, that it's two steps. Step one, creation. Step two, power or life given to that creation. And that's the same thing that we have in the story of the papacy. It's created, the beast is created, and then it needs power to be able to do what it's going to do throughout these 1260 years. And that is the dragon that's giving it that power, essentially. So, in okay, we won't go there. But now going back to Revelation 13 and verse 5 onwards, I just want to remind us that this is the same dynamic that we have with the image of the beast. Verse 15 describes that the dragon has power to give life to the image of the beast. That's a parallel to verse 2, which is describing the papacy, where the dragon gave the beast power, seat, and authority. I'm emphasizing this two-step process because I think it's important to see, or else you miss the full picture that's being told. Without Justinian's decree, you don't have 538. And likewise, the other way around. They codependent. They have to be visible. Each of them has to be visible because there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. And this concept is not new to us, at least within the movement. A while back, I can't remember the name of the video, but Elder Tess did studies on the nature of waymarks, and she pointed out that a waymark itself has this cause and effect relationship embedded within it. You have two dates that you can give a waymark, and she does this for 1989. She does this for 2001, 2016, etc., 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 etc. I mean, she stopped doing it 2019 because I think that was where we were at the point when she did the study. But the point that she was making is that when you see a waymark, the dates of that waymark are meaningless unless you can tie it to a story, unless you can tell that waymark's existence within a context. And that context is supported by this bookend of two dates. For 1989, she gave September 11 and November 9, where you have that picnic on the walls of on the border of the Berlin Wall, and that leads to its eventual fall because there's protests that broke out after September 11, and that leads to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it's the same story in 2001, where you have the Twin Towers fall on 9/11, but it's not until November 9 that you have radical Islam restrained. And I think that's a good point to point out the necessity of seeing this cause and effect relationship, because she makes the point, Elder Tess, that we often point out that the restraint of radical Islam takes place on September 11, but Islam, or radical Islam, or the East Wind, wasn't restrained on 9/11. That's when they were at their peak, if anything, because their mission was successful. But she tells this story how on November 9, when America goes into the Middle East, they successfully restrain the East Wind. And I won't go through that study in full, but I just want to make this point so that when we line this up with our history and we think about the Sunday law, we can think about it within the context of a cause and an effect, where an image is created and then life or power is given to that image. And what is that life and power that's given to this created image? It's the arms of the dragon that this image is going to use to do its work, if you can put it that way. In the story of Papal Rome, it was in this Daniel 2. This is the statue of Daniel 2, my stick figure. You had iron represented here, which was pagan Rome. And as you transition down into the legs and into the feet, it's Papal Rome, but we make the point that there's only 4 kingdoms that are represented in this story of Daniel 2, because this iron goes all the way down into the feet, where it's iron and clay. So the papacy, the church, clay, is going to mingle with the iron. So you see the papacy, you see the dragon, which is pagan Rome, all the way down in the feet. And it's the arms of pagan Rome that the papacy is going to use. And so that's what this power is, this life. So when we come to the Sunday law and we have an entity here, which I had discussed was the lamb-like beast, you have the USA here, it's going to be the USA here again. It's the same entity before and after this waymark as it was in 538. The arms here, or the kingdom here, the state before 538, and then its state after 538. Okay, so we have this cause and effect relationship pointed out in prophecy at a waymark level. I'm suggesting at least that we have to be consistent enough to see it. What you'll notice though is that in each of these histories, it's years. So there's 312 and 313, and these events don't all happen in the same year. 321, 325, 533, 538. And for me, that's not a concern with regards to why Elder Tess is now going to say 1989 has two, at our time of the end, has two dates within the same year. Because what I'm comparing and contrasting is a concept, a principle. I'm not necessarily comparing and contrasting that everything is going to work the same. I'm taking a concept from an earlier history, and I'm taking that concept to apply into our history. And so this Edict of Milan, etc., I'm suggesting lines up with the time of the end. And if you hadn't have guessed it already, I'm suggesting that this Nicaea and Arian controversy lines up with 2001. And why I say that is because in studies long ago, we would mark that the foundations are laid starting at 2001. And something interesting to note as well is the meaning of the name Nicaea. It was named after a Greek goddess who was the Greek goddess, I think, of waters, rivers, fountains, etc., that gave life to the area around it. And so I'm suggesting that these waters to give life can be marked here. And of course, we mark rain as coming down in 2001 to give life. Okay, so now we need to ask ourselves the question, what are these cause and effect? What is this cause and effect in our story of the rise of the image of the beast? I'd like to go back to studies that Elder Tess did at the beginning of her Vespers classes, and at least in this time period, in navigating the different debates that we're having, I found it useful to go back to old studies, because I think in those old studies we can find a lot of truth. And so it was done in two parts. It was separated in two parts, but essentially it was one study. So if you want to watch it again at your own time, it's There Is No Church, in inverted commas, State Union. And I'll give you the date just in case you want to easily look it up. And what she was pointing out in those studies, what Elder Tess was trying to demonstrate, is that when we take the model of two streams at an Exeter waymark, the two streams are attached to a culture war. So when we say Fox News and CNN in America, it's all within the context of this culture war. And so the midnight cry is going to teach us or tell us about the Sunday law that's coming. And this fight is not going to be a fight over Protestantism or Adventism or church doctrines, if you want to call it. It's going to be a fight over culture. And this resistance to progressives that you see playing out in America, whether it's regards to race or gender or immigration, it's a culture war. And so she delves into this idea of a culture war as being the thing that's dividing society, not just in America, but around the world. It's dividing politics, and she references a book called The Struggle to Define America that was published in Our Increase of Knowledge 1991, and it's about these culture wars. And she goes through that presentation pointing out that if you were to approach conservative Christians, they're not really going to defend their religion as much as they're going to defend their cultural identity. And then she talks about the controversy with FFA and Elder Jeff, and pointing out that it was the culture that was attacked. And she's hammering home this point that embedded underneath all these debates that we have in society is a common theme about culture. It's a culture that's built on top of patriarchy. And it has become the thing that people hold most sacred, their cultural identity, more so than their religion. Because religion and culture are really two sides of the same coin. And so the implications of all of that and that study is that the Sunday law is a reaction against social progress. It's a reaction within the midst of this culture war. And it's not just the church-state union as we've identified it in the past, in the 1888 history, but more so it's this culture state union, if you want to call it that. This is not to say, though, that church doesn't play a part, or the evangelicals don't play a part in this story, because as you recognize, these evangelicals that are appealing to Trump's base, if you want to call it that, are doing so from a perspective of these are our religious beliefs. But underneath all of that is culture. They're two sides of the same coin, as I said. Prior to 1989, in studies that Elder Tess has done, we look at this 10-year history that leads up from 1989. And we talk about the Afghan war, the 10-year proxy war that takes place with regards to the USSR and the Soviet Union. But there's something else that takes place in that history, and that's the rise and influence of the moral majority, which comes to its close in 1989, really. But what this decade was doing was that it was your evangelical churches under what was his name, Jerry Falwell, etc., coercing or seducing the Republican Party specifically to align with their moral or social agenda, and trying to get their religious ideology embedded into a political party. And they found that the Republican Party was the conduit that could take this fight forward for them. And so when we talk about abortion, for instance, in America, and the fight over abortion rights, we need to ask ourselves the question, is that a fight that's a cultural issue, or is that a church issue? And depending on the perspective that you're going to look at it, the case could be made that it's both. It's both a cultural issue and a church issue. But the reason why Elder Tess brought up this issue of the moral majority was to point out that these churches, the evangelical churches prior to 1989, needed a conduit to take their message forward, to take their message into America. And the host that they found was the Republican Party. And there's a reason why she traces the progress of the Republican Party throughout our timeline. It's because now the Republican Party is going to be the voice for these issues that are going to divide society. If we compare and contrast how God works with how Satan works, we say that God first takes the message to the church and then to the world. So Satan needs a church. In like fashion, Satan needs a church before they can take the message to the world. So two stages, church and then world, And in this time period of church, then world, God is going to draw out a people that's going to be their church, who are going to take the message to the world. And we see that with us in a simple fashion. The stone needs to be cut out from the church first, who become the church, and it's that church that's going to evangelize to the world. And so, comparing and contrasting how God works, I'm suggesting Satan works in a similar fashion. Satan needs a church first to set up a church before going on to evangelize everyone else. They need a host, a stone of their own, if you will. And so this might be a rhetorical question, but in fact, it is a rhetorical question. If evangelical churches in America today are going to do the evangelical work for Satan, who's going to listen to them in America? Who's going to listen to pastors going around spreading this message with regards to the message that Satan once put out? Barely anyone in modern society. There have been several polls that have been done by pretty well-established pollsters, one of which is a group called Pew Research Center. And in the 1990s, they did a poll with regards to the Christianity in America, and approximately 90% of people in America identified as Christians. I don't know what the statistic was in 1888. It doesn't go as far back as 1888, but at least in the 1990s it was 90%. I would probably think that in the 1880s, 1800s, it was slightly higher. But as of 2023, the most recent poll done by this agency, it's dropped 25% or so to 68% of people who identify as Christian. So the trend is downwards with regards to how many people identify with Christianity. Now that's Christianity. Another poll that's done by another group called the Barna Group regarding practicing Christians, the decline has been even more. So in 2000, so that's one poll. In 2000, they did a similar poll, but now trying to find out practicing Christians, and about 45% of people identified as practicing Christians. So you can say I'm a Christian, but whether you go to church and, will defend your religion strongly is what's encompassed by this term practicing Christians. And then in 2019, that dropped to by about half to 25% of practicing Christians. The point that I want to make by looking at this data is that if we compare the 1800s to today, religion isn't a priority for Americans. It's not. Yeah.
Sorry, could I just ask you to write the two sentences, Pew on the first one and the other one?
Yeah, sure thing. Pew Research Center, and this bottom one is called Barna Group. And you can find other polling groups. It's just the two that I found primarily. But wherever you look with regards to who's doing these polls, the point is that religion and Christianity, religion as a whole, is declining in America and pretty much around the world. In other countries, might be on the rise, but generally speaking, religion isn't a big part of people's lives as it was in time past the 1800s specifically. So, if Satan is going to give a message for people to receive their mark, the mark of the beast, is Satan going to use churches? I read an article which expressed what I'm talking about pretty nicely. And I'm not endorsing the site where it came from, so I'm not going to tell you where it came from um, or give you the link to it, but I'm just going to read and quote from this article. It says, last week, Gallup put up a poll that shows for the first time that affiliation with a church, synagogue, or mosque no longer defines a majority of Americans. In the 2 decades since the turn of the millennium, religious affiliation has gone from around 70%, where it stood more or less in the 1930s, to a mere 47%. So you can see there's a bit of discrepancy with regards to who's doing the polling. But the key point is that there's a drop. Among millennials, only 36% say they belong to an organized religion. For European, us in European, this is no big deal. But for Americans, it's a big thing because of how embedded Christianity and evangelical Christianity was in American psyche. And then a few paragraphs later, the author says, this is what I find particularly interesting. What we're witnessing, it seems to me, is not a collapse in the religious impulse as such. The need to transcend, to find meaning and purpose, is eternal for humans. What we're witnessing is what happens when politics replaces or becomes a form of religion. The fusion of evangelical Christianity with the Republican Party blasphemously climaxed in the Trump cult. Among the Trump banners and Confederate flags in the crowd that invaded the Capitol on January 6 was a flurry of wooden crosses. And in wokeness, the younger generation are quite obviously replicating previous religious movements in America. Look at the zeal in their eyes, the relentless search for heresy, the ostracization of sinners, the mass confessions of iniquity, and the need to do the work every day to bring about the kingdom of anti-racism. And so what this author is pointing out is that really politics has replaced religion in people's lives as the thing that's going to divide people. Politics is the religion of culture wars, essentially, where religion has churches. So your religion, your deistic belief, if I can call it that, has churches, and those churches are going to have battles over doctrine. Politics, the equivalent of politics is political parties. So where in the 1800s it might have been churches who are arguing, today it's political parties that are arguing. There's a book, I'm just pulling it out, that I read, it's called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And in this book by Jonathan, I can't pronounce his surname, Haidt, he points out something which is telling this similar story, is that religion and politics serve similar functions in society. They bind groups together through their shared moral beliefs. They create a sense of belonging, and they often rely on sacred values that aren't easily questioned. So the point is that it's reinforcing this concept that Altapamenda has taught about before, that religion and culture are really two sides of the same coin, or religion and politics, if you want to call it that, are two sides of the same coin. So from all of this, it's to say, who is Satan going to use to spread their message? I'm going to suggest that it's not churches in the same way that it was in the 1800s or the 1260. It's going to be political parties that are going to do that, because it appeals to a wider base, a wider audience, given modern society. As I said, when we do our studies about prophecy, it's always useful to review the past as we try and understand the present, to review studies that we have done historically, because I believe they give us a lot of grounding. And one of those studies, which I think is beneficial when trying to understand current history, is the study in Daniel 11 from verses 11 through to, I'm just going to say 16, that talk about the Battle of Raphia and Panium. I tried looking for material that I could point people to if they wanted to review these studies, but my sources didn't have that material on hand. But I'll give a high-level overview of these verses and the applications that brought us to Raphia and Panium. A friend of mine had asked me a question about Raphia and Panium, and so I started looking at it. But while trying to answer their question, it led me in a different direction, which is what I'd like to explore now. So remembering these 2 points, the points that we've made. Point 1, there's a cause and effect relationship at the Sunday law, where an image is created and that image is given power. Point number 2, what is Satan going to use as the conduit for their message? I'm suggesting that it's political parties that are going to do that work, where churches might have done that work in the past, where it was a Sunday law issue. The churches are going to appeal to the state. Now it's going to be political parties, now that it's a culture war. And then coming now to this third subtopic that we're going to explore, Raphia and Panium. So in Daniel 11, in verse 11, it talks about the king of the south being moved to fight against the king of the north, and the king of the south wins, essentially, that battle. And we tie this to the Battle of Raphia. You can read Uriah Smith's commentary on these verses if you want the historical breakdown. But then in verse 13, 14, and 15, it talks about the king of the north coming back to fight against the king of the south, to defeat the king of the south. And so this is describing the history of the Battle of Panium. Embedded within those verses, verse 13 and 15, it talks about the robbers of thy people that are going to rise up to establish themselves, exalt themselves, but eventually they're going to fall. And so the robbers of thy people that you have in verse 14 is Rome. That's Rome rising up, to get to the point in verse 16 where it says, and I'll read this one in full. But he that cometh against him, so now it's talking about Rome, shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be overcome. Uriah Smith gives commentary about this in his book Daniel and Revelation. I'm not going to read it for time's sake, but what he points out is that Antiochus was defeated by Pompey. I think it was Pompey. And then in 63 BC, so now we're in verse 16, in 63 BC, we have Rome marching into the glorious land. So what happened was Pompey took his armies and acquires jurisdiction of Judea by conquest in 63 BC. And so we have verse 11 equals Raphia. We have verse 15 equals Panium in 200 BC. Raphia being in 217 BC. And we have verse 16 in the glorious land, if you want to call it that. And this we tied to the Sunday law. We should all be familiar with this. And this was 63 BC. But what's interesting is that while Pompey was marching into Judea, or while Rome, I can't remember if it was Pompey is marching into Judea, something else was taking place back at home. And it's this that I wanted to point out. as significant in 63 BC. So we have Raphia, Panium, Sunday law in our history. 2019, 2021, question mark 2020, Sunday law. If you had watched my studies prior, I had already made the suggestion that this is 2024, and I think most people in the movement are comfortable seeing 2024 as the Sunday law. It's the dates that the arguments are over. But anyway, when Alderterry did her studies and she marked Quintus, or she took Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges at the Sunday law. This was because Aldertes recognized, or at least placed, Rome sending ambassadors to Egypt as being in 272. Studies have been done by other teachers that point out that historians generally don't recognize that Rome sent ambassadors to Egypt in 272. And so Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges, the assertion at least is being made that Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges can't be placed here in 272. Instead, they should come here in 273. But when Alderterry was doing her studies about Quintus Fabius, I want to remind us that that wasn't the only thing that she used when exploring July as a potential Sunday law. She also placed Julius Caesar there as well because of his name, Julius Caesar, and Julius being the precursor to what we would know today as July. He named July July because of himself. And so Julius Caesar can be marked there in 20 at this waymark. But we often put Julius Caesar there because of his role as a dictator. He establishes a dictatorship. But from this story of Raphia and Panium and 63 BC, I suggest that you can mark him there as well. So what took place in 63 BC? I'm just going to read straight from Wikipedia. In 63 BC, Caesar, as in Julius Caesar, stood for a position that was called the praetorship, and he also stood for the post of Pontifex Maximus. So, Pontifex Maximus. Reading on. Pontifex Maximus was the head of the College of Pontiffs, and it was the highest ranking state religious official. In the pontifical election before the tribes, Caesar faced two influential senators. So there's going to be an election in 63 BC, a vote about who's going to be Pontifex Maximus. And Caesar's going to face off against two people. Publius Servilius. I don't have space. I am pronouncing these badly. Isoricus, however you pronounce it. So this person's going to run against Caesar, and the other person that's going to run against Julius Caesar is, lo and behold, Quintus Lutatius Catulus. And when historians or scholars look back at this election, they look back in awe because Caesar's candidacy at this point just wasn't taken seriously. He was a populist. He was an outsider of the system. He just wasn't what would have been expected. Publius and Quintus were respected officials. They had held post in the past, and so it was odd that Julius Caesar thought he could challenge them. And he won. He won that vote that election for this post. Just talking about what Pontifex Maximus is. It's Latin for the word supreme pontiff, and this was the chief high priest of the College of Pontiffs in ancient Rome, and it was the most important position in ancient Roman religion. The word pontifex and its derivative pontiff became terms used for Christian bishops. So it's essentially where we get the title for the Pope today of the Roman Catholic Church. Reading from a book called Caesar by Adrian Goldsworthy. So the book is called Caesar, and the author is Adrian Goldsworthy. He writes, the post of Pontifex Maximus, head of the College of 15 Pontiffs, of which he was a member, speaking about the prior person who held this position, became vacant on the death of the current incumbent. The current incumbent's name was Quintus Cecilius Metilius Pius, who was yet another representative of the prolific Metili, who already considerably prominent, had been further boosted by their support for someone else. He's telling a story about something else. But the dictator that had been prior placed the election of the appointments to this and other senior priesthoods in the hand of the Senate. So the Senate are the ones that chose who was going to be Pontifex Maximus. However, at some point in the year, Labinius passed a bill reverting to the former practice of appointment by popular election. So there's a popular election that's going to take place that's going to decide who's going to be Pontifex Maximus. In another paragraph by the same author, he says, the Pontifex Maximus was an office of immense prestige, and in many ways the most important of all Roman priesthoods. As a result, it was eagerly sought by many of the Republic's leading men. My point is, this was not an ordinary election. This was an important election because this person is essentially going to be the head of the church of the Roman Empire. And Julius Caesar wins this election, surprisingly, this vote. So we have three names or three people involved in this election: Quintus, Publius, and Julius Caesar. Now, thanks to the story of Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurgis, we already know a lot about Quintus, at least the definition of the name Quintus. So I won't go into that, the pre-nomen Quintus, with regards to the 5th month, and the 5th month in the Roman calendar being Quintilis, and how in the Julian calendar that becomes July. So we have this symbology already. So while Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurgis, historians will move him to 273, I think that here in this story at 63 BC, which lines up with the Sunday law, there's another Quintus that we can put there anyway. The other names of the people involved is this Publius Servilius Isaracius. Now, Publius means of the people. And his nomen, so this Publius is his prenomen, and his nomen is Servilius, is servant or slave. Essentially a servant. But in its historical context, while service might have meant slave in later Italian, when they made those translations, in early Roman history, it indicated this idea of service, duty, or loyalty, not necessarily slavery. So you have a servant of the people in Publius Servilius, servant of the people.
Curtis, just to let you know, it's 11:32.
Okay, I'll start wrapping up. I've made the case that in Daniel 3, that's a story about representatives, about public servants, that when those people are called to the plains of Jura, it's not your ordinary citizens, it's your officials that are called as representatives of those people. So, I mean, Julius Caesar, Julius meaning, I can't remember what it means. But you can look at Elder Terry's study to remind yourself of what Julius means. But Caesar meaning elephant killer. So at this waymark, at this waymark, 63 BC, which lines up with the Sunday law, there's several things that I want to highlight. Voting, Julius Caesar, Quintus, and Publius Servilius. And in Elder Terry's studies, she demonstrated how Daniel can be broken up into two sections. The first three representing Adventism, and the last three representing the institutions that keep the king in check. And Daniel goes through different phases. He plays two different roles. So I bring this up to talk about what we were talking about before, is that I want us to think about what falls at the Sunday law when we say Babylon is fallen, in the context of a culture war. In the Dark Ages, from 1798, from 538 to 1798, you had the churches that broke away from Rome, that are going to protest against Rome, and God is going to expect them to do that work, the Protestants. So when the Millerites stand up in 1798 and onwards, and they say Babylon is fallen, they recognize the sins that those churches have gone back to. They've fallen, those religious churches, because God needed them to do a work, but now they're not progressing and they're not doing that work anymore. When we think about our scattering or our time period of darkness from 1863 to 1989, who was doing God's work in a culture war with regards to civil issues in this time period? When you look into the Republican Party, you will recognize that it goes through a transition where, having been formed in 1854, it's going to represent the interests of the people. It's going to represent civil issues, race rights, women's rights, etc. in its earlier history, as much as it could in that time period. But then it's going to go through an alignment in that time period. It's going to transition into being what the Republican Party is today in the context of the culture wars. That full realignment is what we were discussing in this time period of the moral majority, where now, from being what God used to spread a message in 1863 with Abraham Lincoln and onwards, as fighting for these on the right side of the issue, if I can call it that, is going to go through this realignment and are now going to be the aggressors that are going to stop the work. So the Republican Party did God's work in our dark ages until it shifted and we get to a stage where I'm suggesting the Republican Party is fallen at the Sunday law and its cup is full. There's an article that talks about the RNC in 2024. I promise I'm wrapping up. I just want to finish this point. And it talks about the RNC as being a hotbed for civil religion. If you just look up religion at 2024 RNC, a term that was popularized in the 1960s that refers to a devotion and dedication to one's nation state that mirrors a kind of traditional religious devotion. And they're discussing this within the context of Trump as a civil religion. So, all of this that we've discussed, I'm suggesting that at the Sunday Law Waymark, the cause that we spoke about before is what Elder Terry has identified already as July 18, when Trump wins the vote to make him Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Church of Trump, the head of that base, the Republican Party. Remember how we spoke about overlaying religion, politics with church, is that in a culture war, it's political parties that are going to do this messaging. So that political party needs a Pontifex Maximus, a pope, and Trump wins the vote to be that pope, which lines up with the events of 63 BC. In the 5th month that you get from Quintus, representation of public servants in Publius Maximus and Julius Caesar, where the elephant is killed, the elephant killer. Caesar is the elephant killer. 2 articles were shared by Elder Parminda on the media broadcast on the 6th of October. One is called How Trump Transformed the Republican Party, and Trump remade the GOP in his image and its platforms in his word. So July 18 was the death nail in that coffin. Babylon is fallen, is fallen. The Republican Party is fallen, is fallen. This is not to take away the commentary that we do have about churches and evangelical churches in America. It's looking at it within the context of a culture war, that the Republican Party and seeing its collapse is important in the context of a culture war, because that's the medium that Satan is going to use to spread their message. And so in July, the GOP is now dead, and it's now the MAGA movement, if you want to call it that. So that's the cause. We didn't have time to explain the effect, but if you had watched my previous studies, I'm just going to say it in a summary fashion. That effect is December 17. You can put under it November 5, but the reason why that election, I think, is the effect is because now the image that's created in July 18 is going to be given power in December. Now this image has the state's backing to promulgate their doctrines in the Sunday law history. And if you want reasons why I look at December and July, I'd refer back to those previous studies that I did. So just to recap, we went through Revelation 13 and the power that the beast gets from the dragon. It's a parallel of the papacy. We went through the papacy's history and its rise, culminating in 538, and this 5-year period between 533 and 538. And the cause is July and effect December, and this 5-month period between the two. And then we spoke about culture wars and this shift from churches being the ones that are going to do Satan's work to political parties as the ones that are going to do Satan's work. And so that's our cause and that's our effect. But the key thing that I wanted to bring out, the key history, is this. It's 63 BC, and when Rome goes into the glorious land, is that there's an election where Caesar takes office as Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex Maximus. I never studied Latin, clearly. And then there's all this symbology that's attached there. We didn't have the time to explore this symbology in greater detail, but the key thing is that even if we move Quintus to 273, which would be our increase of knowledge, there's another quintus that you can place in 63 BC, which lines up with the Sunday law, as well as two other important names that you'll see, Publius Servilius and Julius Caesar. So that brings me to the close of the study. I ran a bit over time. I apologize. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for the opportunity to go through these studies. I pray and ask that you may be with us as we seek to understand you better, seek to understand the world around us better, and the politics that are raging on. It's my prayer that we can be able to see the image that is created, because if we don't recognize that image, then it would be difficult for us to recognize when that image speaks at the loud cry. And so I pray that you may be with us in our studies. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.